4. Air intelligence. The dawning of World War in 1939 found the United States rather unprepared in another area of intelligence operations, a relatively new field, but nevertheless a function which Japan and the principal European powers had greatly refined at that time. Air intelligence had been inaugurated in the American armed forces at the outbreak of the Civil War, with balloonists or aeronauts serving both with the field armies and with the Signal Corps. Footnote: generally see F. Stansbury Hayden, Aeronautics in the Union and Confederate Armies, Baltimore, The Johns Hopkins University Press, 1941. End footnote. The loosely organized Balloon Corps of the Union forces, disbanded in June 1863, did not exceed 7 balloons and 9 trained aeronauts during its period of operation. Footnote: U.S. Air Force Department, Air University Research Studies Institute, Development of Intelligence Function in the USAF, 1917 through 1950, by Victor H. Cohen. Typescript, January 1, 1957, Chapter 1, page 16. Copies of this study bear the marking Secret. The copy utilized in this study was declassified and supplied by the Office of the Secretary of Defense. End footnote. Its mission was observation, a most rudimentary intelligence task. During the Spanish-American War, the Signal Corps dispatched its only available balloon and 2 aeronauts to Cuba, where they apparently saw 2 brief but effective days of service in the attack on San Juan Hill. Although a second balloon unit was organized at Tampa, Florida, to accompany a new expeditionary force to Puerto Rico, the armistice rendered their departure unnecessary. Almost 4 years after the Wright brothers successfully demonstrated the ability of a machine-powered, heavier-than-air apparatus to carry man aloft, the chief signal officer of the Army, Brigadier General James Allen, established, on August 1, 1907, an aeronautical division in his office. 2 years and 1 day later, after a number of trial tests, approval was granted for the purchase of the first Army flying machine from the Wrights. Quote, by the time of the long-delayed recognition of the Wright brothers in 1909, the Army's interest in aviation had been primarily for the purpose of improving reconnaissance. The first heavier-than-air craft, as well as lighter-than-air craft, was evaluated by the military solely in terms of collecting information. It took only a few years of Army experimentation with airplanes to conclude that there is a greater development potential for military reconnaissance in the airplane than in captive or dirigible balloons. Therefore, practically all available funds for aeronautics in the Signal Corps, beginning with fiscal year 1912, were devoted to the purchase and maintenance of heavier-than-air craft. This was a bold decision because limited airplane performances by that time had not demonstrated any military value other than that the Army could extend its range of vision. Airplanes were valued for their relatively passive role of spying out the enemy's disposition and not as actively aggressive weapons in themselves. Despite experiments made in shooting machine guns, taking pictures, and dropping explosives from planes, the Signal Corps decided to adopt 2 types of airplanes, and both for reconnaissance missions. The Scout was desired for service with ground troops, for carrying 2 pilots and radio and photographic equipment, and for traveling at least 45 miles per hour for 4 hours. The Speed Scout was designed to carry only 1 pilot at a minimum speed of 65 miles for 3 hours. End quote. In 1913, the House Military Affairs Committee explored the possibility of creating an air unit apart from the Signal Corps, but found little favor for the idea. Footnote: see U.S. Congress, House, Committee on Military Affairs, Aeronautics in the Army. Hearings, 63rd Congress, First Session. Washington, U.S. Government Print Office, 1913. End footnote. 3 years later, Army airmen were afforded their first opportunity to operate under combat conditions when the 1st Aero Squadron was deployed in support of Brigadier John J. Pershing's Mexican border campaign. While a number of missions were successfully completed, quote, The most significant lesson, which was brought forcibly to the attention of the government and the people, especially in the face of the rapid development of aviation during the European War, was the need for increasing and properly equipping an Air Force to accomplish the missions assigned to it. Consequently, Congress appropriated $500,000 and over $13 million in March and August of 1916 to expand the aviation section of the Signal Corps, which had been established in 1914. The total of these sums was 13 times greater than all the money that hitherto had been appropriated for Army aviation purposes. End quote. As generous as these appropriations were, they proved insufficient to significantly improve the Air Corps for immediate participation in hostilities when the United States entered World War I the following year. Quote, "The United States entered World War I without a single pursuit or combat-type airplane. Hardly a single flying officer was adequately familiar with aircraft machine guns, bombing devices, aerial photography, or other aviation instruments well known to the aviators of England. In all respects, the nation was several years behind European aviation development. In fact, the Director of Military Aeronautics reported that, in contrast to European developments, the United States at the time of its entry into the war stood very little ahead of where it had been before the World War broke out. If the United States had a doctrine for aerial employment, it centered on the use of the few aircraft for the support of ground forces as observation and courier vehicles. At the time of America's declaration of war, the aviation section consisted of 65 officers, 2 flying fields with 224 airplanes, mostly training types, nearly all obsolete in type when compared with the machines then in effective service in France. In addition, there was little combat experience or knowledge of European war lessons upon which to base an adequate statement of aerial mission and a plan for aerial production to implement that mission. For a long period, European nations guarded certain things, especially about airplanes, from American observers. Unfortunately, actual American participation in war was necessary before the concept of aviation as a flexible and mobile instrument of war, and not merely as an intelligence collecting agent, could be given a preliminary trial." End quote. Once the declaration of war had been made, efforts got underway to organize air intelligence activities. Quote, "Prior to America's entry into World War I, military aviation was considered nothing more than an information collecting service performed by lighter and heavier than air craft for the use of individual ground commanders. Adequate intelligence organizations for the systematic collection, collation, evaluation, and dissemination of information to all commanders concerned did not exist. It was the prevailing concept that troop commanders in combat should use their own available means and resources for securing information about the enemy. Higher commanders would get what they needed by means of their own agencies or by direct request to commanders in contact with the enemy." End quote. At no time during the war did the Military Intelligence Division in Washington have a subsection responsible for air intelligence matters. Such was not the case in France. Quote, "Under the general theory of intelligence prevailing among the associated powers, intelligence units in the AEF, American Expeditionary Force, were established in all organizations beginning with the battalion, and each echelon was responsible for intelligence on its own front." End quote. Quote, "The task of obtaining, assembling, weighing, and distributing information on all phases of the enemy's aviation, including its organization, material, personnel, operations, and the location of its units, was the responsibility of the Office of Air Intelligence, G2A7, the AEF Military Information Division's 7th subsection, which had been organized in March 1918 by Lieutenant Prentice M. Terry, who was later succeeded by Major C. F. Thompson. As officers in charge of the Air Intelligence Subdivision, they were responsible for furnishing the general staff on GHQ, the staff of armies and corps, and the Air Service with intelligence concerning the enemy air arm. The first 3 months of G2A7's existence were consumed in organizing the work of the office, in collecting intelligence information from French and British intelligence offices, and in visiting Air Service headquarters for the purpose of determining how best it could be served." End quote. The subsection ultimately established 5 units for performing its duties: an interrogation of prisoners section, staffed by 1 officer; the Air Order of Battle section, responsible for tracking the size, organization, markings, location, duties, equipment, and personnel of enemy air units; a Bomb Targets section; a Technical section, responsible for assembling and disseminating information on the production, performance, and maintenance of enemy aircraft; and an Enemy Air Activity section, responsible for collecting, assembling, and disseminating intelligence on enemy air strategy and tactics, enemy aviation training, and the effects of Allied air operations. Quote, "In view of the limited air operations during World War I, the list of air intelligence functions to be performed by approximately 7 officers and 16 enlisted men in G2's Office of Air Intelligence sounded more imposing than they actually were. Before the office could gain much experience in the new branch of military intelligence dealing with air matters, the war ground to a halt. Nevertheless, G2A7 was destined to become a prototype of the air intelligence organization of the next World War." End quote. Liaison between the AEF MID Air Intelligence subsection and units of the Air Service was conducted by branch intelligence officers who were under the supervision of G2A7 and had staffs consisting of a clerk, 2 draftsmen, and an orderly. Sent to air groups and squadrons by the Office of Air Intelligence, the branch intelligence officers did not merely confine themselves to obtaining intelligence information about the enemy air arm. They, in fact, acted as the intelligence officers of the air unit to which they were assigned. Quote, "But the control over intelligence operations in air units by BIOs, who were detached officers from the Military Intelligence Division of the GHQ, AEF, was objectionable to the Air Service and its predecessor organization, which had been headed by Lieutenant Colonel William Mitchell, Aeronautical Officer, AEF. The work of air intelligence was believed to belong properly to the Air Service, and that such intelligence would be made available to G2 at Headquarters AEF through channels and liaison activities. The thesis of the supporters of this idea was that air intelligence officers required a technical knowledge of aviation for the proper performance of their duty. If possible, intelligence officers should be qualified aerial observers so that they could better appreciate the problems of observation and be better able to interrogate observers returning from intelligence-gathering missions. It was impossible, they said, to get good results from a system which gave prominent place to intelligence officers detailed to the Air Service as representatives of G2, but not responsible to the Air Service. If squadron intelligence officers were integral parts of the air squadrons, they could be selected from among candidates for pilots and observers, and they could be partially trained during the squadron's organization and training period. During that time, the air intelligence officer would be able to build up comradeship and a sense of responsibility which could not be expected from a general staff representative who did not join a unit until it was at the front. Inasmuch as Corps and Army aviation commanders were responsible for the actual collection of air intelligence by means of visual and photographic reconnaissance, they should be better able to exercise closer supervision over the collection and dissemination of air intelligence by lower units than any branch intelligence officer. Moreover, adherents to the doctrine of Air Force control over air intelligence believed that such control would make the Air Service more independent and freer in its effort to be progressive and efficient." End quote. Because of this sentiment, the Flying Corps sought some vehicle to serve its needs regarding intelligence production and placed its trust for this function in the Information Section. Quote, "The Information Section of the Air Service could be considered a quasi-air intelligence organization which duplicated G2A7 operations for the avowed purpose of disseminating air intelligence and information more quickly and widely throughout the Air Service." ISAS had its origin in General Order 21, Headquarters AEF, 13th of August, 1917, which directed departments and corps, including the Air Service, to designate an officer specifically charged with the collection and dissemination of military information relating to his organization. Early in September, an information department was inaugurated in the Air Service. It was charged with the collection, preparation, and distribution of all information of special interest to the Air Service, liaison with the Intelligence Section, General Staff, AEF, and the organization and supervision of air information officers attached to Air Service units. Little information of the personnel and records of that department are available. Evidently, it passed through different commands until February 1918, at which time its duties were absorbed by the Intelligence Division of the Training Section, Air Service, AEF. End quote. The Training Section's intelligence unit had been inaugurated in Paris in December 1917. A month later, efforts were being made by the section chief, Captain Ernest L. Jones, to expand his unit from training responsibilities to central intelligence operations for the entire Air Service. On March 28, 1918, the Intelligence Division was given its mandate to serve the intelligence needs of the entire Air Corps and was renamed Information Section Air Service. Quote, by the end of the war, the ISAS had grown into 6 subdivisions: statistics, library, general information, editorial and research, production, and history. Its personnel had increased from an original staff of 2 officers and 1 enlisted man to 10 officers, 30 enlisted men, and 3 civilians. End quote. Quote, the trials and tribulations of the ISAS in finding its place in a new service under wartime conditions were essentially repeated by its comparable organization in America. The genesis of the first intelligence office in the Army Air Arm appears to be early in March 1917, when Lieutenant Colonel John B. Bennett, officer in charge of the Aeronautical Division of the Signal Corps, recommended on the basis of a General Staff memorandum that his division be expanded in functions and personnel. His plans included the establishment of an air intelligence unit. The reorganization of the Aeronautical Division, approved on 16th of March by General George O. Squire, Chief Signal Officer, provided for an Air Intelligence Office under the Personnel Subdivision, which was redesignated Correspondence Subdivision shortly after the United States declared war. The functions of the small intelligence office, headed by Captain Edgar S. Gorrell, were to collect, codify, and disseminate aeronautical information. End quote. A few months later, in June, the unit was renamed the Airplane Division, and a reorganization placed the Intelligence Section on a par with the other 3 new major subdivisions for training, equipment, and organization. Placed in charge of the new intelligence unit was Major Henry H. Hap Arnold, destined to become World War II Chief of Staff for Air, assisted by Ernest L. Jones, longtime owner, editor, and publisher of Aeronautics magazine. Quote, the duties of the Intelligence Section at this time consisted largely of collecting and filling military aeronautical data of every nature and from all sources, and making digests of pertinent information for interested officials. Intelligence material from military attachés and other representatives abroad had been flowing into the OCSO since the early days of aeronautics in the Signal Corps. But after the United States entered the war, the British, French, and Italian governments released information of greater value and volume. The pressures of war caused further expansion and changes in the Airplane Division. On 1st of October, the Air Division succeeded the Airplane Division. Brigadier General Benjamin D. Falloy continued as chief, with Colonel Arnold as executive in charge of the 15 sections constituting the entire Air Division of the Signal Corps. The Intelligence Section was redesignated the Information Section, and Captain Harold C. Candy succeeded Lieutenant Jones as officer in charge. The latter was soon promoted to captain and ordered overseas to continue similar work in the AEF, Training Section, Intelligence Division." End quote. Although further organizational alterations occurred, there was little variation in the Information Section's functions until President Wilson, by an executive order of May 20, 1918, designated the Division of Military Aeronautics, which had been created within the Signal Corps during the previous month. Quote, "An independent agency with the duty of performing every aviation function heretofore discharged by the Signal Corps, except those pertaining to the production of aircraft and aircraft equipment. The newly established and independent Bureau of Aircraft Production, BAP, created on 24th of April 1918, was given complete control over the production of airplanes, airplane engines, and aircraft equipment for the use of the Army. In August, Mr. John D. Ryan, then Second Assistant Secretary of War, was appointed Director of Air Service in charge of both the BAP and DMA. As a result of these reorganizations, the Information Section on 21st of May became the intelligence branch of the executive section of the DMA. About 2 months later, it was redesignated the Aeronautical Information Branch, which, by the end of August, had been organized into 7 sub-branches: procurement, confidential information, publicity and censorial, statistics, clerical detail, auxiliary, and headquarters bulletin. Throughout the war, the functions of the Air Intelligence or Information Sections in the Signal Corps and their successor, the Aeronautical Information Branch of the DMA, primarily consisted of the collection and dissemination of information pertaining to domestic and foreign aviation activities, including those of the enemy, the maintenance of a library and complete files, properly cross-indexed, of all information and statistics on hand, the continuance of a liaison system with the AEF, foreign governments, and other U.S. government departments, and the censoring of articles and photographs for publication submitted through the Committee on Public Information. The American Information Unit exchanged bulletins and other material with its counterpart in the AEF, the Information Section of the Air Service. The general information and technical bulletins published on both sides of the ocean pertained to every phase of aviation. Indeed, the Washington Air Information Office, like its analogous section overseas, was a quasi-intelligence organization concerned in part with knowledge about the enemy." End quote. One other wartime structure is of interest at this juncture: the Research Information Committee. Quote, "The RIC, with branch committees in Paris and London, had been organized in the early part of 1918 by the joint action of the Secretaries of War and Navy, and with the approval of the Council of National Defense. In cooperation with the offices of military and naval intelligence, the RIC was to secure, classify, and disseminate scientific, technical, and industrial research information, especially relating to war problems between the United States and its allies. By this plan, the government endeavored to establish a central clearing exchange information service by means of which the Army General Staff, the various bureaus of the Army and Navy, the committees of the Council of National Defense, and the scientific organizations in the United States working on war production and inventions could be kept posted on technical and scientific developments at home and abroad. The RIC in Washington consisted of a civilian member representing the National Research Council, a technical assistant, the chief of the Military Intelligence Section, MIS, and the Director of Naval Intelligence. As a result of its membership on the RIC, the Military Intelligence Section was made responsible for securing and disseminating scientific and technical research information for all branches of the Army. The MIS was assisted in its duties by the liaison representatives to the RIC from the DMA, BAP, and other military bureaus. In certain instances, when information could only be obtained by sending experts to Europe, the individuals so designated were supposed to clear through the RIC, which would check to see if the information was available in this country or if the research was necessary. Those cleared for travel were instructed to contact the RIC's Paris or London committee through which any information collected would be dispatched to the RIC in Washington. This was to be done even though different communication channels were employed at the same time by those sent abroad. The overseas committees each consisted of the military, naval, and scientific attachés and a technical assistant. In addition to serving as the clearinghouse for information flowing from both sides of the Atlantic, those committees were designated to serve the commander-in-chief of the military and naval forces in Europe and to cooperate and render assistance to the offices of the military and naval attachés in the collection, analysis, and dissemination of scientific and industrial research information." End quote. With the end of World War I came the exhaustive task of reorganizing the Air Service for peacetime operations. In January 1919, the director of the Air Service was made more directly responsible for the supervision and direction of the Division of Military Aeronautics and the Bureau of Aircraft Production. By mid-March, it was decided that the Air Service would adopt the structure of its AEF operation in France, thereby causing it to gain direct control over both DMA and BAP. Quote, "The information group in the ODAS was designated to receive its intelligence information primarily through the Military Intelligence Division of the WDGS, War Department General Staff, and from foreign missions. Information on military and commercial aeronautics in the United States came from information officers at military posts and from liaison officers with other governmental and civilian air activities. A special division was added to the information group toward the latter part of 1919 for the purpose of collecting and disseminating meteorological information and for handling such special activities as publicity and correspondence relative to congressmen and municipal landing fields for airplanes." End quote. The Army Reorganization Act of 1920 had little impact upon the intelligence structure of the military organization. The Air Service became a coordinate combat branch of the line, and the Division of Military Aeronautics was formally abolished. Quote, "The Director of Air Service was henceforth known as the Chief of Air Service, CAS, similar to the title of Chief held by the other heads of the combatant arms of the Army." End quote. On May 29, 1919, the Research Information Committee, renamed the Research Information Service, was reorganized for peacetime operations under the National Research Council. Quote, "It was not until shortly after Major General Mason M. Patrick succeeded General C.T. Minor as CAS on 5th of October 1921 that another reorganization of the Air Service was adopted. The new structure was patterned after General Pershing's 1921 reorganization of the War Department General Staff, WDGS, into the following 5 divisions: Personnel, G1, Military Intelligence, G2, Operations and Training, G3, Supply, G4, and War Plans. It was natural that the WDGS be organized along the lines of Pershing's AEF. General Patrick's reorganization of 1st of December 1921 abolished the groups and created the Personnel, Information, Training and War Plans, Supply, and Engineering divisions. It was not surprising that General Patrick, who had been Pershing's Chief of Air Service, AEF, should follow the organizational model of his war and peacetime commander. The new Information Division was assigned a more practical mission than its predecessor, the Information Group. Instead of trying to collect every kind of information on aeronautics, the primary function of the Information Division was the collection of essential aeronautical information from all possible sources. Greater concern was shown for the collection of information of an intelligence nature by the requirement that one of the 3 general classes of information should be concerned with the, quote, uses of aircraft in war, including the organization of the air forces of the world, tactical doctrines, types of aircraft used, organization of the personnel operating and maintaining aircraft. End quote. The other 2 classes of information dealt with technical matters and information relative to other phases of military aviation. Because of reduced military appropriations and the lack of personnel, collection and dissemination divisions were abolished during the reorganization, and their duties were assumed by the library and reproduction sections, respectively." End quote. In 1925, the Information Division created a military intelligence section which worked in liaison with the collection section of the Military Intelligence Division of the General Staff. This MID unit, MI5, administered the military attaché system, maintained official contact with state, commerce, and other executive departments involved with foreign matters, and functioned as advisor to the foreign liaison officer on questions concerning the distribution of aeronautical information to foreign countries. However, very little could be accomplished by the understaffed unit. With the passage of the Air Corps Act on July 2, 1926, quote, "The Information Division remained on the coordinating staff level of the newly designated Office of the Chief of the Air Corps, OCAC, as the counterpart to the Military Intelligence Division of the WGS." End quote. Quote, "In placing the Air Corps Act into effect, the organizational changes made in December 1926, among other things, divided the Information Division of the OCAC into 4 sections and renamed them to indicate their major functions. The Air Intelligence Section became the successor to the MID section and inherited the responsibility for maintaining liaison with the MID of the War Department General Staff. The new section was also charged with the procurement, evaluation, and dissemination of foreign and domestic aeronautical information, and with the maintenance and supervision of the Air Corps Library. The photographic section was made responsible for collecting, filing, and distributing all photographs taken by the Air Corps. A voluminous file of negatives of scientific, historical, and news value was maintained. The publications section received the duties of printing, reproducing, and distributing all publications and documents such as information circulars, airport bulletins, air navigation maps, etc. The press relations section, replacing the special section, was charged with the preparation and release of all news items and with Air Corps publicity matters." End quote. These efforts at reorganization, however, did not necessarily result in a better air intelligence capability. Quote, "Functionally, the Information Division, in the early part of the 30s, had reached a new low. The Plans Division, OCAC, took over part of the Information Division's functionings of collecting, evaluating, and disseminating intelligence information because of the latter's failure to send out copies of important reports to the Tactical School and to various Air Corps instructors and individuals. When Lieutenant Colonel Walter R. Weaver became chief of the Information Division in June of 1933, his first moves were to protest vigorously against this usurpation of functions and to strengthen his organization. His actions were backed by the Chief of the Air Corps, who then confirmed the Information Division's responsibilities for 1. The collection and dissemination of air intelligence information concerning foreign countries, 2. The compilation and distribution of information on military aviation, and 3. The coordination of matters of interest between the Air Corps and the State Department and the Military Intelligence Division of the WDGS. Under Colonel Weaver's guidance, the Information Division increased its effectiveness, and by mid-1934, it had added a number of additional duties, including the collection of comparative data on plane and personnel strength, air budgets, and general organization of the air arms of England, France, Italy, Japan, and the United States. This function was assumed by the Intelligence Section, which for many years was staffed by 1 officer and from 2 to 5 civilian employees. Nevertheless, the section during fiscal year 1935 not only made comparative studies of national air forces, but it also was able to initiate a digest of foreign aviation information. The evaluation and distribution of such air intelligence, the Chief of the Air Corps said later, quote, has been of vital importance and interest. Owing to the increased aviation activities abroad, the volume of this particular type of work within the intelligence section has materially increased. End quote. Recalling his thoughts on the eve of war in Europe, General Hap Arnold, appointed Chief of Air Corps on September 29, 1938, wrote, quote, "Looking back on it, I think one of the most wasteful weaknesses in our whole setup was our lack of a proper air intelligence organization. It is silly, in the light of what we came to know, that I should still have been so impressed by the information given me in Alaska by that casual German who called my hotel and told me about their new bomber. I know now that there were American journalists and ordinary travelers in Germany who knew more about the Luftwaffe's preparations than I, then the Assistant Chief of the United States Army Corps." From Spain, where our Army observers watched the actual air fighting, reports were not only weak, but unimaginative. Nobody gave us much useful information about Hitler's Air Force until Lindbergh came home in 1939. Our target intelligence, the ultimate determinant, the compass on which all the priorities of our strategic bombardment campaign against Germany would depend, was set up only after we were actually at war. Part of this was our own fault. Part was due to the lack of cooperation from the War Department General Staff's G2. Part to a change in the original conception of the B-17 as a defensive weapon to a conception of it as a weapon of offense against enemy industries." End quote. And what had Arnold learned from the Lone Eagle, which neither military nor air intelligence could supply? Quote, "Lindbergh gave me the most accurate picture of the Luftwaffe, its equipment, leaders, apparent plans, training methods, and present defects that I had so far received. Chief of the German Air Force's shortcomings at that time seemed to be its lack of sufficient trained personnel to man the equipment already on hand, a fact which might make unlikely powerful sustained operations through 1940. Göring's neglect of strategic bombardment and logistics was not yet apparent. On the contrary, German industrial preparations were enormous, and bombers with a range for strategic attacks almost anywhere in Europe made up a large part of his force, though these same DO-17s and HE-111s could also be employed for direct support of ground troops. Lindbergh felt that Hitler held the destruction of any major city on the continent or in Britain in his hands." End quote. Footnote: Leonard Mosley, How the Nazis Used Lindbergh, New York, V9, March 3, 1976, 32-38. End footnote. Arnold had been made aware of the deficiencies of air intelligence operations from other quarters, including the chief of his plans section, Lieutenant Colonel Carl Spaatz. As war plans were developed by the War Department and the strategic employment of air power applied, accurate air intelligence became essential for the execution of those plans. But as Spaatz informed Arnold in August of 1939, such intelligence data was not being maintained ready for issue in the Office of the Air Corps or elsewhere. Quote, "As a result of Spaatz's counsel, an Air Corps board was convened a week before Hitler's attack on Poland to determine the nature, scope, and form of intelligence required for aerial operations. Also, the board was to make recommendations as to the methods and procedures for obtaining and processing that intelligence. After meeting daily for several days, the board, composed of intelligence representatives from the OCAC, ACTS, and GHQ-AF, made what was doubtless the most comprehensive analysis for air intelligence requirements to that time. The intelligence needed by the Air Corps, the board stated, fell into three categories. A, that required by the CAC for strategic planning in connection with the preparation or revision of joint basic war plans and the employment of air power in any theater. B, that required for technical planning to ensure American leadership both in the production of planes and equipment and in the development of adequate tactics and techniques for aerial operations. C, that required for tactical planning and execution of plans. The board recognized G2's responsibility for collecting and processing all intelligence information. Except for the processing required for War Department estimates, however, the board believed the Air Corps to be better qualified to handle intelligence information on certain phases of foreign aviation. Accordingly, the board recommended that the Air Corps should continue its current task of preparing air technical intelligence and should assume the responsibility for processing information pertaining to tactical operations and to the use of aircraft in anti-aircraft defense. For strategic intelligence required by the Air Corps, G2 was considered to be in a better position not only to prepare economic, political, and combat estimates, but also to determine the vulnerability of potential air objectives and systems of objectives, together with an estimate of the probable effect of the destruction thereof. The board also suggested that General Arnold, as Chief of the Air Corps and Principal Advisor on Air Matters to the Chief of Staff, WDGS, be allowed to establish in his office an air intelligence agency considerably larger than the existing Information Division's Intelligence Section." End quote. Never submitted for or otherwise given War Department approval, this report marked the beginning of a controversy, continuing into the time of United States entry into the war, between the Military Intelligence Division, War Department, and the Air Corps' Intelligence Organization over air intelligence activities and responsibilities. When the Information Division, OCAC, started collecting intelligence information outside of G2 channels, the MID directed that this activity cease and that requests for such data be routed through the Military Intelligence Division. This action occurred in the autumn of 1939. Relenting somewhat in May of the following year, G2 permitted the Air Corps' Information Division to make direct contacts for intelligence information with all federal agencies except the Navy and State Department. Quote, "The War Department's G2 had been cognizant for some time of the incompetency of the personnel in his intelligence branch to maintain digests of aviation information. Moreover, as the branch was organized on a geographic basis, with each geographic section being responsible for all phases of intelligence for the countries assigned, it became obvious that a separate unit was needed to evaluate and interpret the voluminous amount of air intelligence being received. Shortly after Hitler's attack on Poland, a separate air section was established in the intelligence branch of the MID for the purposes of coordinating all air intelligence activities, of maintaining a current summary of air operations, and of supervising the preparation of air intelligence. The air section apparently was not formally established until March 1940, when Major Ennis C. Whitehead, who was chief of the Southern European section of the intelligence branch and the only Air Corps officer on duty with G2, was named chief of the new air section. For the first 4 months, he was assisted only by Lieutenant Marvin L. Harding. In July, Mrs. Irma G. Robinson was transferred to the air section from the Air Corps' Intelligence Office. When Whitehead, who had been promoted to lieutenant colonel, was replaced by Lieutenant Colonel Jack C. Hodgson in the late summer of 1941, the total personnel in the air section consisted of 5 officers, 3 analysts, and 4 clerk stenographers. Attempts were made to enlarge the section by acquiring more airmen, but the AAF itself had an urgent need for personnel to fill its numerous vacancies and made a counteroffer for the removal of G2's air section to the Intelligence Division of OCAC, where it would operate on behalf of G2. Of course, the offer was declined, and the extension of air intelligence activities in the MID was retarded. Until Pearl Harbor Day, the air section could only process the air files for the British Empire, Germany and satellites, France and Italy. Eventually, as personnel became available, full responsibility was assumed for the G2's air files of all countries." End quote. Not only were air intelligence activities hampered by jurisdictional disputes, but the security procedures of MID also impeded operations in this sphere. Quote, "In an early effort to clarify one phase of the jurisdictional problem relating to intelligence dissemination, the War Department on 15th of November 1939 formally stated the functions of the MID and the arms and services. Unless documents were marked "No objection to publication in service journals," reproduction and redistribution of G2 reports by arms and services required the consent of the Assistant Chief of Staff, G2. Each document permitted to be reproduced also had to contain a statement of sources, and its classification could not be lower than the original document. For the Air Corps, such a policy meant that G2 information could be circulated but not reproduced, even for dissemination to the limited number of Air Corps headquarters agencies. Hence, intelligence was sometimes stale by the time it was circulated to an interested user. Security, not economy, was the basis for limiting distribution. The MID, highly security conscious because of the character of its work, was especially desirous that the intelligence currently being supplied be carefully safeguarded. But the necessity for securing G2's approval before reproducing and distributing each intelligence report emanating from his office hampered the Air Corps' efforts to keep pace with aviation developments arising from the experiences in the European War. Consequently, General Arnold secured blanket authority on 1st of March 1940 to reproduce and disseminate 1 or 2 copies of G2 materials to major operating Air Corps agencies, but they were prohibited from making additional copies. G2 thought the exception granted Arnold was justified so long as Europe was at war and while the Air Corps was engaged in an expansion program. Shortly thereafter, reproduction restrictions were further modified by G2's permission to the OCAC to make as many as 5 copies of any confidential or restricted MID document." End quote. Still, the intelligence dissemination problems continued in spite of G2's reluctant grants of approval for increased copy distribution within the Air Corps. In an effort to further ameliorate intelligence dissemination difficulties, a conference of OCAC intelligence representatives and MID personnel was held in the spring of 1941. Among the various views expressed at this meeting, quote, Brigadier General Sherman Miles, acting ACSG2, was especially fearful that if the CAC were to determine what MID intelligence should be disseminated to his units, then it would be possible for the Air Corps to authorize the reproduction of verbatim secret reports from military attachés or executive departments of the government, from strategic studies required in war planning, and from papers prepared in compliance with specific requests of the War Department and other government agencies. Although the air arm would have been limited in its reproduction and redistribution by regulations on safeguarding military information, protecting the source of information, and limiting distribution to those with a need-to-know basis, General Miles refused to permit any exceptions to existing rules. Moreover, he advised intelligence agencies under control of the Chief of the Army Air Forces to confine their dissemination of information to the Air Forces generally to tactical and technical matters directly affecting the Air Forces, and that no dissemination be made by those agencies without the consent of this division of any secret or confidential information regarding the present disposition, strength, or effectiveness of foreign forces, ground or air. Such a restriction, along with the others requiring approval of G2 prior to reproducing and disseminating intelligence, hampered air intelligence operations not only at the AAF headquarters level, but also down to and including the commands. A2, Air Force Intelligence, obviously knew the intelligence needs of air units better than an outside agency, and he continued his efforts to secure exemptions from the irksome prohibition placed upon him by the WDGS. But freedom for the AAF to reproduce and redistribute G2 material did not come until Independence Day in 1942, when the Chief of the Military Intelligence Service, MID, authorized the commanding generals of the AAF and the air commands to reproduce and distribute to lower echelons any and all classified military information received from G2, unless the document contained a specific prohibition against reproduction. Formal War Department approval of G2's action came the following month. End quote. Still, the major jurisdictional question, the rivalry for control over air intelligence between G2 and A2, persisted. Seeing no other course of action open to him on the matter, Arnold, with AAF intelligence needs continuing to mount, placed the issue before the Chief of Staff, General George C. Marshall, and asked for a command decision on his recommendation for the removal of all restrictions thought to limit the reliability and efficiency of air intelligence operations. On September 10, 1941, Arnold had his decision. The War Department supported G2's position for continuing the unity of strategic intelligence responsibilities, saying, quote, "The responsibility imposed on the Military Intelligence Division, WDGS, for the collection, evaluation, and dissemination of military information includes that which pertains to the Army Air Forces as well as to other arms. In carrying out this responsibility, the Military Intelligence Division is charged with the compilation of all information for the purposes of formulation of comprehensive military studies and estimates. It will prepare those studies and estimates. Intelligence agencies of the Chief of the Army Air Forces will be maintained for the purpose of the compilation and evaluation of technical and tactical information received from the Military Intelligence Division and other sources, plus the collection of technical air information from sources abroad through cooperation with the MID, all or any of which is required by the Air Forces for their development and for such operations as they may be directed to perform." End quote. In fact, however, the decision was not as devastating to Air Force intelligence objectives as might be presumed. As General Arnold stated, "We are getting what we want, and that we will simply try out the whole scheme." End quote. This cryptic remark meant that a quiet and amicable settlement between G2 and A2 had been reached. As recorded in the minutes of an Air Staff meeting on 11th of September 1941, quote, General Scanlon stated that G2 had agreed to practically everything we had asked for. Much of it will not be written, but is understood. Permits us to obtain information ourselves, but first we must check through G2 to determine if they have the information desired. If not, then our personnel can be assigned to obtain it. Personnel, so assigned, will work through G2's organizations. In regard to studies G2 has been working on reports received from their sources, arrangements have been made that G2 will furnish us the complete report, and we will make our own study. We are authorized to contact direct foreign military attachés on duty in this country and other government departments." End quote. During this particular period of conflict with G2 over air intelligence jurisdiction, the Air Corps, of course, continued to undergo expansion, administrative adjustment, and reorganization. During the autumn of 1940, General Arnold began making some changes, including the redesignation of the Information Division as the Intelligence Division, effective December 1, 1940. New components added to the unit included a domestic intelligence, counterintelligence section, and an evaluation section. Continued were the administrative, foreign intelligence, press relations, and maps sections. The library and photographic sections were transferred to a miscellaneous division. Quote, prior to the creation of a counterintelligence or domestic intelligence section, the functions assigned to it, including the collection and dissemination of information concerning espionage, sabotage, subversion, disloyalty, and disaffection, had been performed by the Information Division's intelligence section. By January 1940, a separate counterintelligence branch had been established, but for many months no officer was available to head it, and the work was supervised by the Chief of Intelligence Section, Major J.G. Taylor. By the time of the Air Corps reorganization in December, the volume of counterintelligence operations had mounted to a point warranting the establishment of a domestic intelligence section, with a force of 2 officers and 3 enlisted men, as one of the principal components of the Intelligence Division. The establishment of an evaluation section grew out of the suggestion made to General Arnold on 23 October 1940 by Colonel George E. Stratemeyer, Acting Chief, Plans Division, OCAC. Noting the vast amount of intelligence material flowing into the OCAC and then being reproduced and distributed without being digested, Colonel Stratemeyer recommended the creation of an evaluation unit in the Information Division, not only to summarize and analyze the material for busy commanders and staff personnel, but to dig out lessons indicating necessary policy changes and new projects requiring attention. The then current system for evaluating information and securing the necessary action was in the hands of the Air Corps Board at Maxwell Field, Alabama. Within personnel limitations, the board had been evaluating and studying wartime lessons in order to prepare and revise air tactical doctrine and to provide educational and training material for combat personnel. With the establishment of an evaluation section, the board was to continue its past functions, but in its evaluation of war information, it was to report any foreign development and trends which might become apparent. It was the evaluation section, however, which was given the primary responsibility for detecting foreign developments and trends for summarizing all pertinent foreign intelligence appearing in periodic air bulletins." End quote. Because of the hostilities in Europe, the Foreign Intelligence Section was the largest and fastest growing unit within the Intelligence Division. It consisted of a current intelligence branch, a foreign liaison branch, and an operations planning branch. While the first of these components was responsible for processing information pertaining to current military developments, quote, very little actual collection, other than from such open sources as the New York Times, was involved, because the Military Intelligence Division was supposed to do all the collecting and then to forward to the OCAC whatever concerned air intelligence. End quote. Quote, the Operations Planning Branch of the Foreign Intelligence Section, created as the result of an executive directive issued in December 1939, had developed into a significant element of the Air Corps, which was emphasizing strategic offensive operations against enemy air power and enemy national structures. The branch had been initially designated the Air Force Intelligence Branch of the Information Division's Intelligence Section, and it brought to that section some specific duties and planning functions never before assigned to the Air Corps. In general, operations planning intelligence fell into two categories. First, to provide the CAC with air intelligence upon which he could base air estimates for various war plans. Secondly, to compile air intelligence upon which to conduct initial air operations under each established war plan. Specifically, the duties included such functions as analyzing foreign national structures to determine their vulnerability to air attack, preparing objective folders of specific targets in connection with war plans, maintaining current data on the strength, organization, and equipment of foreign air forces, including detailed technical data on performance and construction of foreign airplanes, keeping a complete file of airports and flying facilities throughout the world, and preparing air route guides for the movement of air units to potential theaters of operation. At the time of the OCAC's reorganization in December of 1940, the Operations Planning Branch was manned by 5 officers and 10 civilians under Captain H.S. Hansel. End quote. In April 1941, as a consequence of a formal study conducted by the Plans Division of the operations and functions of the Office of the Chief of the Air Corps, a special assignment unit was established in the Public Relations section of the Intelligence Division, and the name of the Foreign Liaison Branch became the Air Corps Liaison Unit. Further changes were evident in the Air Arm in August, with 3 sections within the Intelligence Division being renamed. The Domestic Intelligence Section again became the Counterintelligence Unit. The Foreign Intelligence Section was retitled the Air Intelligence Section, and a Foreign Liaison Section was created from the renamed Air Corps Liaison Unit previously located within the old Foreign Intelligence Section. By the summer of 1941, the Intelligence Division consisted of 54 officers and 127 civilians. If air intelligence personnel were able to hurdle the stumbling blocks imposed by mounting organizational charts and changes and time-consuming preparations of budget requests and justifications for money and personnel, they were confronted with jurisdictional obstacles. The delineation of intelligence responsibilities between the Air Arm and the MID was a continuing one, and when the Army Air Force, AAF, was created on June 20, 1941, the problem of clarifying responsibilities of the Air Arm became an internal one as well as an external one. The AAF had been created to substitute unity for coordination of command, thus making it superior to both the Air Corps, which was the service element headed by Major General George H. Brett, and the Air Force Combat Command, AFCC, formerly the GHQ Air Force, which was the combat element headed by Lieutenant General Delos C. Emmons. General Arnold had the responsibility for establishing policies and plans for all Army aviation activities, and the Chief of Staff, WDGS, was the person to whom he was accountable. Arnold also retained his position as Deputy Chief of Staff for Air, and thus in his two positions he was able to pass on air matters brought up by the members of the WDGS, as well as the commanding generals of the AAF's main components. To assist the chief of the AAF in the formulation of policies, an air staff was established by using as its core the OCAC's Plans Division, which had been organized into sections corresponding to the divisions of the WDGS. The air sections were renamed A1, A2, A3, A4, and AWPD, Air War Plans Division. Thus, by lifting the Plans Division out of the Air Corps, the chief of the AAF had a ready-made air staff. All papers, studies, memoranda, etc. pertaining to purely air matters, which hitherto had been processed by the WDGS, were to be prepared for final War Department action by the chief of the AAF. The exceptions were those papers pertaining to the military intelligence and war plans divisions of the WDGS. The air staff was to assume the air planning functions formerly performed by the WDGS. Its operating functions were confined to the preparation of policies and instructions essential to directing and coordinating the activities of the two major AAF elements. Thus, in theory, the Air Staff was the policy agency, with the Air Corps and the Combat Command performing operating functions." End quote. However, because the relationships between the AAF and the War Department were not clearly defined, old difficulties between the Air Arm and the General Staff continued in many instances. In addition, friction developed between the AAF headquarters and the Office of the Chief of the Air Corps, which had been the principal administrative unit of the Air Arm. Between June of 1941 and March of 1942, various activities were withdrawn from OCAC and relocated with the Air Staff, but with a view to maintaining separate operating and policy-making entities. Quote, "The strained relationship between the air staffs of the AAF and the OCAC could not endure for long. The crisis created by the Pearl Harbor attack, together with the subsequent prohibition imposed by the OCAC against informal communication between its divisions and the air staff, undoubtedly accelerated the transfer of operating activities out of the OCAC. Not until the elimination of that office by the War Department reorganization of March 1942 was air intelligence planning and operating completely consolidated into one office, that of the Assistant Chief of Air Staff, A2. End quote. Until the collapse of France in June 1940, air intelligence liaison with Great Britain was cautious, formal, and conducted with the customary restrictions on the release of classified information. As German armies overran Denmark, Norway, Belgium, and the Netherlands, traditional military and naval attaché contacts were the conduits for the exchange of intelligence information between the United States and embattled England. Then came the fall of the Fifth French Republic. Quote, all that seemed to stand between Hitler and American security was Great Britain. This alarming condition erased all pretenses at observing neutrality. The new American policy became assistance to the democracies by all methods short of war. Obviously, realizing that knowledge is power, especially in warfare, President Roosevelt approved in July a British proposal for the interchange of scientific data. In a swift follow-up, the British dispatched to Washington a commission of technical experts headed by Sir Henry Tizard, scientific advisor to the Ministry of Aircraft Production. The mission was authorized to exchange secret data on such things as radar, fire control, turrets, rockets, explosives, communications, etc., which items obviously interested the American military services. Initially, the British, as they expected, gave more scientific information than they received, but the general result of the conversations of the Tizard mission with representatives of the American Armed Services and the newly created American National Defense Research Committee, NDRC, was a great stimulus to research on new weapons on both sides of the Atlantic. End quote. By January 1941, after some British hesitation on the idea, an NDRC office was opened in London, and during that month, the United States gave the British the means for deciphering the Japanese code. Quote, the policy of close collaboration afforded a broad base for the exchange of general military information as well as scientific. Early in August 1940, about the time Hitler began his air blitzkrieg on the island kingdom, the British and American governments had agreed secretly for a full exchange of military information. The MID, as coordinating agency for such an exchange, desired all requests for military information from abroad to be specifically worded and routed through G2 channels. But G2's radio and mail requests to England did not always secure the information desired, especially on technical matters. It was found extremely difficult to phrase specific questions, even for technical personnel, when there was very little data upon which to base precise queries. Sending officers to England was considered by G2 and the chief of the Air Corps Intelligence Division as the best means for gaining information which was not readily available through attaché channels or not at the disposal of the Tizard mission or other British delegations sent to the United States. End quote. Thus, a bevy of Air Corps officers were dispatched to Great Britain during 1940 and 41 as individual air observers in supplement to the regular military attachés. When, in March of 1941, joint Anglo-American war plans were perfected, called ABC-1, they provided for the creation of special observer groups of American officers to ostensibly function as neutral observers, but to also prepare for conversion into an advanced staff element for a theater of operations should the United States enter the war. Quote, under ABC-1, the SPOBS, Special Observation Groups, was to become the official care of the United States Army Forces in the British Isles, which later actually became the European Theater of Operations. SPOBS's Air Staff Section eventually evolved into the Air Technical Section, ETO Headquarters, and then redesignated Directorate of Technical Services of the Air Service Command, United States Army Air Forces in Europe, with the functions of providing for the inspection and evaluation of captured enemy aircraft and directing the activities of air intelligence field teams. The entire SPOBS groups wore civilian clothes, and to the casual observer, it would seem that the American Embassy was expanding its staff. Each officer in SPOBS had contacts with a section of the British Army or Royal Air Force which corresponded most nearly to his own. Lieutenant Colonel Homer Case, SPOBS G2, for example, conferred with the British Ministry on methods of training photo interpreters and then he recommended that American personnel be permitted to take advantage of the RAF's Photo Interpretation School and units. Compared to British developments in that field, the United States was in the elementary stages. Also, while getting acquainted with British operations and making war plans, the SPOBS provided the War Department with a listening post which relayed intelligence concerning the world's war fronts." End quote. Meanwhile, on the home front, efforts continued at easing the way for the exchange of technical data with the British. Quote, "In the interests of economy, efficiency, and simplicity for all arms and services, the Secretary of War designated the ACS-G2 to coordinate the exchange of information with British representatives in America. In matters of aeronautical equipment and technical information, the Air Corps in the fall of 1940 was authorized by G2 to divulge data to authorized representatives of the British Empire on unclassified, restricted, or confidential information, but secret documents which could not be reclassified to a less restricted category had to be cleared by G2 prior to release. Requests for information from the British Air and Purchasing Commissions in America normally were made through the Foreign Liaison Branch of the Intelligence Division, OCAC. Directed negotiations by the Air Corps with the British representatives were permitted for the interchange of technical information, with the understanding that G2 would be advised in the form of receipt copies of information secured and released." End quote. On another matter, when the Air Corps in May 1941 indicated a desire to establish a branch intelligence office in New York, it was repulsed by the Assistant Chief of Staff, G2, on the basis that such a request infringed upon his exclusive responsibility for collecting intelligence information and would duplicate an MID effort, as that agency already maintained a field facility in New York. Since MID did not have an air operation expert in the branch office, an OCAC Intelligence Division analyst was loaned for this purpose. Quote, "By 1st of August 1941, the branch office's new project of producing target folder for the Air Corps was in progress. The original folder program involving single targets was extended to cover increasingly large areas until the Air Corps sectionalized and numbered the various theater areas. From then on, area target folders were produced. Air target materials were collected from files of trade data, records of financial transactions, engineering reports, travel diaries, field notes of scientists, and other similar items existing in the New York area. This material could not be shipped to Washington for processing and had to be examined at the sources. Fortunately, the New York office was located contiguous to and worked closely with the Army Map Service, thus enabling the office to produce a bonus in the form of topographical and geographical intelligence. The MID proposed to expand its branch in New York so as to increase the production of objective folders. But in light of the current international situation and the great magnitude of the task involved in ferreting out available data existing within the United States, General Scanlon, on the day before Pearl Harbor, told G2 that the proposal was modest in the extreme. The outbreak of war, of course, became the signal for accelerating all expansion plans into high gear, and the branch office, for example, was gradually assigned sufficient personnel to enable it to provide essential intelligence for A2's targeting operations for German and Japanese areas. But it was the San Francisco branch which concentrated on collecting available intelligence information on Japanese industries. Then came the debacle of Pearl Harbor, December 7, 1941. A2 was a madhouse, recalled one of the first officers assigned to air intelligence in AAF headquarters after Pearl Harbor Day. Sitting at a desk cluttered with ringing telephones connecting important air installations, the intelligence officer who valiantly attempted to handle the large number of incoming calls during the hectic first days of war reminded an observer of an old-fashioned movie. In those days, a newly assigned officer would see red upon entering an office of A2. With ever-increasing demands for intelligence, desks in a crowded small room were frequently piled high with documents, and as almost everything was classified, the prevailing red security cover sheets seemed to lend a reddish hue to the room. A new officer could see red both literally and figuratively. In one instance, for example, an officer was rushed from his pistol patrol of Bowling Field, Washington, D.C. to A2 only to wait days before someone could find time to assign him specific duties. Even then, the young and inexperienced intelligence officer had to use his own judgment and imagination as to how his tasks should be accomplished." End quote. Efforts were soon made to restore order to military operations in the aftermath of the Japanese attack. The only truly functional air intelligence entity was the Air Corps Intelligence Division, and it was quickly sought by A2 in a centralized intelligence plan. Quote, "After a period of negotiations, the views of the higher headquarters finally prevailed, and the Chief of the Air Staff on 23 January 1942 directed the Chief of the Air Corps to transfer to A2 all the functions, personnel, and equipment of the Foreign Liaison Section and the Air Intelligence Section. The latter was the heart and soul of the Air Intelligence Division, because it was composed of the current unit containing the file of technical intelligence collected over a period of years, the evaluation unit charged with correlating and evaluating intelligence, and the operations unit, which translated intelligence into air estimate and target objectives. A small number of officers and civilians of the Air Intelligence Section were permitted to remain in the Intelligence Division so as to allow the CAC to continue his command functions and responsibilities. The sections remaining in the Intelligence Division were Maps, Counterintelligence, and Air Intelligence School. Furthermore, copies of all intelligence matters received by A2 were to be sent to the OCAC. A sufficient amount of air intelligence functions remained in the OCAC to prevent the attainment of the goal of centralization of intelligence authority. Further complications and duplications resulted from the operations of an Air Intelligence Office in the Military Intelligence Division of the WDGS." End quote. The importance of the air arm in the prosecution of the war soon became evident, and accordingly, quote, "The War Department, through Circular 59, issued on 2nd of March 1942 and effective on 9th of March, decided that the most effective organization which would give the desired freedom of action for all services and at the same time ensure the necessary unity of command was one having 3 autonomous and coordinate commands under the Chief of Staff: Army Ground Forces, Army Air Forces, and the Services of Supply, later renamed Army Service Forces. The overall planning, coordinating, and supervisory role of the WDGS was reaffirmed, but enough air officers were to be assigned to the War Department to help make strategic decisions. The goal of 50% air officers on duty with the WDGS was never reached, principally because qualified Air Corps officers were so scarce. Thus, G2 was not only able to enlarge his air unit, but he was reassured of this responsibility for collecting all intelligence, both air and ground. Nevertheless, the reorganized office of A2 was to make the most of the grant of autonomy to the AAF. As the result of the reorganization of March 1942, the intelligence functions of the OCAC and Combat Command were transferred to A2, headed by Colonel R.L. Walsh, who had replaced General Scanlon on 21st of February 1942. A2, however, lost the activities and personnel of its Foreign Liaison Section to G2's newly established Military Intelligence Service, MIS. About the same time, the Intelligence Service, IS, the Air Intelligence Operating Agency comparable to the MIS, was established under the supervision and control of A2. The first director of the IS, Lieutenant Colonel C.E. Henry, was assigned the functions of collecting, evaluating, and disseminating technical and other types of intelligence, training air intelligence officers, and operating the security services. To accomplish these duties, the administrative, operational, informational intelligence, less the current unit, and the counterintelligence sections were transferred from the A2 division to the IS. The administrative section served both the IS and A2. With the IS as the major operating agency, the other sections under A2 were executive and staff, combat intelligence, and current intelligence. A plans section was also established in A2 for the purposes of formulating plans for collecting and disseminating air intelligence, training intelligence officers, establishing air intelligence requirements, coordinating projects with the air staff and the WDGS divisions, and establishing liaison with other American and foreign intelligence agencies. The section was short-lived as a separate entity as a result of A2's order for its absorption into the executive and staff section." End quote. 3 months after the March reorganization took place, a formal survey was conducted to deal with weaknesses in the new arrangements. A2 had little criticism of the scheme except for a clearer relationship between the counterintelligence groups of the MID, WDGS, and those of the Air Intelligence Service. Quote, "Slight changes were made, and in a few instances some offices were reshifted. In A2, an Office of Technical Information, with a nucleus of 4 officers transferred from the Public Relations Branch, was created as a part of the current intelligence section. Colonel E.P. Sorensen, who had assumed the position of ACAS A2 on 22nd of June 1942, used the newly acquired office to prepare the weekly brief for General Arnold's use in the meetings of the War Council. By the beginning of the following year, the Office of Technical Information had become an independent section in A2's office. In addition to preparing weekly summary reports for General Arnold, the office also handled the AAF's public relations activities and helped prepare for publication the Office Service Journal, Air Force, which on 6th of September superseded the Air Force newsletter. Other newly established units included an intelligence training unit within the Air Intelligence Service. By early 1943, training functions had been incorporated into a training coordinating section and transferred from the AIS to the A2 level. The Special Projects section in the AIS was also moved to A2, where it was eventually incorporated into the Staff Advisors section. In general, the main divisions in the office of the ACAS A2 remained fairly well stabilized from the time of the War Department reorganization of March 1942 until the AAF streamlined its own structure in the following March by abolishing the directorates." End quote. This was the last major reorganization of the Air Arms intelligence structure during the period of the war. Quote, "After an adjustment and reconciliation of the various plans and ideas that had been presented during the previous months, a streamlined organization went into effect on 29th of March 1943. Many offices devoted to the planning or execution of specific functions were telescoped into the offices of Assistant Chiefs of Staff and Special Staff. In the office of the Assistant Chief of Air Staff, Intelligence, all the functions assigned to Air Intelligence were divided among 5 principal divisions: Operational Intelligence, Counterintelligence, Intelligence Information, Historical, and Combat Liaison and Training. The last named divisions combined the Combat Liaison section of the Air Intelligence Service and the Training Coordination section, which had been on the A2 staff level. The current intelligence section was also removed from its A2 staff status and made part of the Informational Intelligence Division. The only units left out of the 5 main divisions because of their service to the entire intelligence office were the Office Services, Office of Technical Information to handle public relations, and Special Projects, formerly Staff Advisors. 2 sections of counterintelligence, safeguarding of military information and training clearance, were transferred to the facilities security and personnel security branches in the Air Provost Marshal's Division in ACAS, Material, Maintenance, and Distribution. By June 1943, the Combat Liaison and Training Division became the Training Plans Division, and given the functions of making studies in and formulating policies and practices for intelligence training in AAF schools and units. At about the same time, the Operational Intelligence and Intelligence Information Divisions were renamed Operational and Informational Divisions, respectively. By October 1943, a few minor changes had been made within the divisions, and 2 new agencies were added. The Air Intelligence School section was created to operate the Air Intelligence School at Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, for the training of AAF officers in combat and base intelligence, photo interpretation, and prisoner of war interrogation." End quote. While certain post-war changes would be effected in the Air Intelligence Institution immediately after the cessation of hostilities in 1945, the next significant restructuring of this intelligence organization would occur with the establishment of the independent United States Air Force in 1947. This is Our Hidden History